Hello, everybody. Welcome to the BasuandGodin Notebook. This is Marc-Antoine Godin alongside Arpin Basu on this Friday, January the 10th. Arpin, we had a special mini pod earlier this week for our paid subscribers about Kent Hughes mid-season avail. We won't go through, all the points and the arguments that we made, during this special episode. But there was a lot of talk about the Canadiens going towards the trade deadline and how it would affect them, how the team plays until the trade deadline, until March 7, will dictate Kent use his actions in regards to his roster. It's interesting that, in French we call that a bilan, or like it's an overview of how things have been. But it's largely about what's to come. That's the interesting part.
That is the interesting part. There were a lot of questions about what happened over the first half of the season. How did you react to your team's defensive struggles? There was a lot of kind of backward-looking stuff that came up there. Kent talking about the lack of confidence at the beginning of the season, how it was manifesting itself on the ice, how the team is now confident, blah, blah, blah. It's, it is the forward-thinking stuff or the forward-looking stuff that's obviously more important. And on Wednesday's episode, we did talk about sort of a more big picture, how are you going to manage the youth and the experience and all this stuff in the coming seasons. But the trade deadline questions, everything that was said from a big picture standpoint applies to the management of the trade deadline. So what we thought we would do today, in light of everything that was said, in light of the need to try to balance youth and experience, in light of the culture that's being created in the room, how do all those things impact each of the four impending free agents that currently play significant roles on this team, and basically all make up almost the entirety of the Canadiens' penalty-killing presence. So let's start with the obvious one, which is Jake Evans. Jake Evans is the talk of the town. Never before have I seen a fourth-line player take up this much airspace in the Montreal Canadiens media landscape.
Steve Bégin, my friend, Steve Bégin.
Okay, so it's been a long time, since Steve Bégin, and Steve Bégin, no one was talking about giving him $4 million a year, right? So it's like it's interesting to me that the Jake Evans situation. He's benefiting from a negotiation standpoint of the fishbowl. The fishbowl is helping him right now because everyone's talking about his contract. There's probably pressure on the Canadiens to get something done. The market seems to want something to come together here. But it's hard not to look at what Kent said over roughly 35 minutes and apply all of it to Jake Evans. It just seems to, I wrote that on Wednesday, but it's culture, experience, helping the young players, not rushing young players, all of it applies to Jake Evans. So we've been going back and forth on a number for a contract for him, but I think, and there's still no rush. There's a little under 2 months left before the Canadiens need to kind of figure out some contract parameters with Jake Evans or make the difficult decision to trade him. Let's revisit what that contract could look like. Has your opinion on this changed at all in terms of what you would be willing to do if you're the Canadiens to keep Jake Evans from hitting the market and to keep Jake Evans off the trade market between now and March 7th?
Well, I heard Elliot Friedman mentioning the fact that some teams had shown interest in in Scott Lawton of the Philadelphia Flyers, and it was sort of understood that the asking price was a first round pick. Scott Lawton, I perceive, is a slightly more offensive version of Jake Evans. He's well, not slightly. He's a more offensive version of Jake Evans, but he's
he's a tough, more physical. He's a tougher version of Jake Evans. I mean, he's got several attributes. Himself, a former first round pick. Yeah,
exactly. And so he makes $3 million a year. He's going to be a UFA at the end of the season, and obviously the Flyers are in no rush to trade Lawton. So to me, it's if Evans was to be put on the market, that would be like a prime competition, and he would probably be considered a consolation prize for any team who would not get Lawton if Lawton was to be traded. So to me, it's there's the number of how much the Canadiens could agree on with him, but there's also what can you hope to get on the market for that particular player. And I think that sometimes we tend to overvalue the players that we cover and that we look at every day. That being said, I think that Gorton and Hughes have shown a good ability in extracting very interesting value for their players since they've started, since they've been in this front office. All that being said, I think that the Canadiens are more in a position where they should stick to the player, keep him. But it's not, the Ridley Gregg on Friday signed a contract. I know that the circumstances are different. We're not talking about a guy who's not about to become a UFA. He's much younger and all that. But 4 years, $3.25 million, that looks like the sort of deal that the Canadiens could get with Evans. To me, it's not. If the number is fair, I don't really care the number of years because at some point.
Well, that's it. I think 3.25 as an impending UFA, you're going to have to go to 5 or 6 years. I don't think 4 years is going to get it done at 3.25 personally. But if you go to 6, which is not crazy, like it gets Jake Evans to like 34, 35, I guess, by the time the contract expires. So it's not an outrageous amount of money. The cap, the percentage on the cap would steadily decrease over the life of the deal. Jake Evans would get, that's what 6 times 3.25 is what $19.5 million over the life of the contract. So I think to get a number in that range, you're gonna have to give some term.
Right. I think but this 6 years it starts to get to be a long time for
you're starting to get into Pierre Engvall territory, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are some guys, some support players. I think of Kaye Yarncroc. Some time ago, he signed a 6 years, $2 million a year contract that turned out to be very, very good value. It was for the Preds back then, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it was. Yes,
but it's very rarely do you see that. We saw that with Scott Mayfield, defenseman with the Islanders. But for a support player to sign long term, you really need to get a very good bang for your buck. And I know that the cap is going to go up, but that excuse, quote unquote excuse, only goes so far. At some point, it's still a lot of money, and you need. I think that in order to go to 3.25, I think that it's actually you would convince the player to accept less term in order to accept that money, because I'm not sure that he's going to be able to fetch $4 million on the open market. And if he does, well, good on him.
Right, but you're trying to find a way to avoid, you can say the cap going up is an excuse. Actually, well, you can't say that because it's a central part of the negotiation. Like it's going to be everything to any player's camp, and presumably Jake Evans' camp as well, to say that for instance, you use Yarncroc's example. Like that contract was signed in 2016 at $2 million a year for 7 years. So you could easily make the argument that in today's dollars, a similar contract for Jake Evans would be $3.25 million a year for 6 years. Like it's more or less equivalent in today's cap environment. That's just reality, and he was coming off a year that looks pretty similar to what Jake Evans might wind up having this. Like he had 16 goals, 14 assists, 30 points in 81 games on a league minimum salary when he signed that deal.
Yeah.
Evans is at what, 10 goals, 13. He's already at 23 points. So he could likely will easily exceed that number. All of which would be a career high. But I do believe that, the $4 million figure is probably not realistic, right? But especially not if you want term. Like no one's going to give him $4 million a year with lots of term. Maybe, well, I don't know if no one. I'm not sure. But the Canadiens have shown a willingness to give term. Well, no, they're reluctant to give term, but for someone that they know, like all the guys that they haven't given big term to, Doc, Newhook, they didn't know them. They hadn't seen them in their own environment, so they had to hedge that. Jake Evans, they know exactly what they're signing, and it's for Kent Hughes to go speak so glowingly about the culture that's growing, and Jake Evans being a culture guy, and also the things that Jake Evans does not necessarily diminishing with age. Like, yeah, he's not going to be as fast as he is right now, and he probably won't score as many goals as he scored this year, probably ever again, frankly. I think you have to go into this contract knowing that this version of Jake Evans that we've never seen before, we might never see again. But you're paying for the things that he has done on a longer basis. The elite penalty killing, just a solid all-around play on the fourth line, and placing a value on that. And I think 3 to 3.5, somewhere in there, is a reasonable number for him, AAV wise, that he could probably exceed on the open market. And in order to compensate for him not exploring that avenue, I think you're going to have to give him some extra term. And I think the Canadiens, in his case, would probably be able to live with that.
Well, it all depends also. Do they consider him to be their next third line center or fourth line center? Because the numbers you're floating, let's say 3.25, if it's 5 years instead of 6, that's the last contract that Adam Lowry signed in Winnipeg. And Adam Lowry is an excellent third line center. He's every bit as good as Evans defensively. He's a rugged guy built for the playoffs. He's got a lot of things going for him. But he got 5 years, 3.25. I don't think that you can be more generous towards Evans than the Jets were with Lowry. And that was 4 years ago. Yeah, you're not dealing. It's not an apples to apples comparison. Yes, the player itself can serve as a comp, but Adam Lowry signed that contract when, and then in 2021.
In 2021. So it's, again, you cannot separate the impending rise in the cap from what Jake Evans is going to argue and what any player is going to argue. Sure. God bless the Colorado Avalanche in trying to sign Mikko Rantanen with this cap rise coming. Like, good luck with that. So it's yes, Adam Lowry at 3.25 is a more impactful player than Jake Evans. I don't think anyone would argue otherwise, but he signed it so long ago that the comp is not fair. That's.
Yeah, but the thing with the rising cap, you're right. Everybody will try to use that to their own advantage, but it becomes the responsibility of a team to say, whatever the cap is, there's going to be a finite amount of money that we can redistribute. And it's not true that it's going to be Christmas Day for everybody. And if we want to be able to get better, we would be wise to keep some money for premium players, for players that not only going to keep us as good as we are, but that can make us significantly better. you know, I'm not going to start saying here, oh, well, you know, they should go after Rantanen if he doesn't sign in Colorado. I'd be dreaming in Technicolor. But still, I think that the Canadiens need to, you know, if they want to get out of this weak link mentality a little bit, you've got to invest towards better players. And because otherwise, it's not, you know, you get a contract, you get a contract, you get a contract.
Well, no, it's not.
No,
but it's just that in any contract signing, like people freaked out when they saw the Leon Draisaitl number, right? And people were like, "Oh my God, how are the Oilers going to compete? What is McDavid going to make? What's going to happen?" Well, Leon Draisaitl is negotiating in a context where the cap is heading towards $100 million.
Mm-hmm.
And over the life of the contract, it'll probably exceed $100 million. And so, like, just with the Adam Lowry comparison, right? Like, when he signed that contract, it took up 3.99% of the cap. So let's say 4% of the cap. That contract next season would be worth $3.7 million a year instead of 3.25. Like, it's at that cap percentage, right? And so that's how agents look at it. It's just reality. You can say it's up to the teams to say not everyone's going to get a contract. Well, then fine. Then the agent can just be like, well, we'll just go to market and we'll make this argument with 31 other teams, and you're not going to get the player. Like, that's a decision that they might have to make. I agree with you. At which point they have to explore trading him. But if they want to keep him, they're going to have to play ball to some extent. No one knows that better than Ken Hughes, right? Like, I mean, there's
sure.
So
yeah, and ultimately, I think that a deal will get done. It's just that I'm not sure which camp really is going to compromise the most here, because Evans is having a career year and he's about to become a UFA, so that gives him obviously some leverage. But at the same time, we've mentioned in the past how he was one of those guys who evaluates himself very reasonably. And I don't think that he's going to get carried away too much by the fact that he's putting up points and scoring at 28% clip. This is not going to last forever. I think that his main calling card is the fact that he's the most used forward in the league on the penalty kill, and the fact that all in all, I mean, no matter the situation, he's one of the most used forwards on the team. So that has a lot of value. But when you compare what he brings to the table and how much he would probably want to stay in Montreal, I think that he's going to be able to find like a medium where he'd be comfortable in staying with Montreal without Montreal having to pay an excessive number of years in order to keep him. I may be wrong, but that's the impression I get.
Yeah, I think if you want it in the low threes, you're going to have to give on term. I just think and it would be fair to do so, because I think Evans can at least get into the high threes on the open market, if not into the fours. And so if you want to keep it at 3, let's say, or 3.25, then yeah, I think you're going to have to go to 5 or 6 years. And I don't think the Canadiens, I don't think that would really bother them. I think paying $3 million for $3 to $3.5 million a year for a really good fourth line player who, like, your fourth line center job is taken care of, and that he can do other things that help you win. While, a lot of teams look at that as being a very replaceable spot on the roster. I think sometimes teams take that for granted, and it's good to have a guy who can either play up the lineup if needed, but you can put on the ice at the end of games to close out games, kill penalties, do all sorts of things, and help shepherd a player like Owen Beck, a player like Oliver Kapanen, and help them along, and ultimately play behind them in a supporting role. I think there's a lot of benefits to it, and I don't think the term's going to scare off the Canadiens in this instance, as long as they can keep the AAV down. And that's the ultimate goal of giving term, is to keep that AAV down. And
Mhm.
so I think there's gonna be a give, right, on either side. And so if Evans is like, okay, I'm not gonna go get that extra 500,000 a year I can maybe get on the open market, but you got to give me something in return. If that means an extra year or two on the deal, then that's how those things get settled, right? So
Right.
let's see what happens.
Okay, let me just because we can transition to another guy here, but if I'm just thinking out loud here, if the
Mm-hmm.
Canadians feel is that it's it becomes too expensive to retain Evans. I know you've mentioned on more than one occasion that there was a foregone conclusion that the Canadians would not re-sign Christian Dvorak, but
Yeah.
if Dvorak presented himself as a more affordable option to be that fourth line center, not to mention the fact that he's a lefty, and the
Mm-hmm.
Canadians have Suzuki is a right-handed centerman, Doc is a right-handed centerman, so is Evans. They could use a left-handed centerman too. Do you think that it could be considered? I've always perceived that Evans was a lot more of a Montreal Canadiens player than Dvorak for not only for the present but for the future. But if it's one or the other, and everybody gets carried away with those negotiations with Evans, could you turn to Dvorak and say, okay, well, maybe that we've got an option here that's cheaper and that would not necessarily need that we commit for too long a term with a player that eventually will be replaced by Kapanen and Beck.
Yeah. Both of whom are also right shot centermen.
Good
So,
point.
um, yeah, I mean, there is Newhook, who I still remain convinced they might be transitioning into a third line center role as soon as next season when Demidov arrives, who we'll be talking about later. But um, yeah, yeah, it's a possibility, I suppose. I mean, listen, Dvorak's going to take a pay cut wherever he plays, wherever he
Sure.
signs. This is
Yeah.
like, there's no doubt, and I'm sure he is well aware of that. So uh, that's not a bad hypothesis because they could probably get Dvorak, much like Armia, on a shorter term deal at less money. But would, I mean, having Dvorak as a stopgap until like Beck and Kapanen are ready to fill those two spots, maybe. At the very least, that could be a negotiating tactic. At the
Because
very
if it,
least, it's
well,
a viable alternative to signing Evans to too many years. I agree.
it's just that if you if I play ball with what you just said and you envision them converting Newhook to a full-time centerman, third line centerman next year because of Demidov, then you're really looking at a fourth line centerman, and just pure fourth line centerman. There's a bunch of them on the market that will be available.
Yeah,
Your
but
Sean.
they don't know those players. I mean, that's the thing that Evans has going for him is that he knows how much this administration values what the known, like the information that they gather within their environment. He knows that they value what the coach thinks of these players. He knows that his coach loves him. Like and what coach wouldn't love Jake Evans, right? Like that is another one of his calling cards is that any coach in the NHL would love to have a player like him. So, and so when he sees that the New Jersey Devils have him on their list of players that they like, that tells him, okay, like that's a winning team. That's a team that has big aspirations. Like, I should have some value on the market. Like there will be teams interested in me.
Yeah.
So, I agree that you can replace him with someone on the market, but you can only take that so far. Like, it's Jonathan. Look at how people reacted to how well Jonathan Kovacevic did in New Jersey, right? There was no room for him here. He was replaceable. The Canadiens actually had in-house replacements for him that they thought could replace him. And ultimately, he was the type of player they needed, and they went out and got, a similar style player, even though he's much smaller, that he's much more mobile. But like Carrier is a defensive right shot defenseman, and they got rid of a defensive right shot defenseman. Like, so sometimes, the guy you have is the guy that you ultimately need. And it's a bit of a clumsy comparison, but I'm just trying to make a point that yes, you can go out and replace Evans on the open market, and you could do that year after year. But Kyle Dubas thought that in Toronto for a long time. Like, these bottom six guys are replaceable. I'm going to give all my money to my top guys, and every year I can go find guys to fill up. And every year what got them in the playoffs was their lack of depth at forward. It killed them year after year. So I don't know. I think
it's just that in this case, you've got both options on the market and kids that will soon be ready for the NHL in Kapanen and Beck for one spot. So, if they
you look at third line center, I mean, if they need to free up the third line center spot, you can just move Newick to the wing, right? I mean, Anderson and Gallagher's contract's going to expire in 2 years. Like, there's going to be spots available for Newhook to fill. So if that's the case, but then again, it wouldn't be ideal at that point to have Suzuki, Doc, Beck / Kapanen, Evans, 4 right shot centers. Would not be ideal either.
No.
So I don't know if we've cleared that up at all, but I don't think we have.
No, and I don't think that. But I think it shows though the multifaceted aspect of this thing. There are many layers to it. It's not just, oh, he's good, we like him, he's been scoring goals, give him all the money he wants.
It's not that at all. It's not that at all. But it's keeping a player off the free agent market comes with a cost. And like we have an example. Like, Joel Armia is the example. The Canadiens had to give him the contract he had to keep him off the market. It was an overpay at the time, and it's been an overpay for the life of the contract. And it's been up until now, or the middle of last season, let's say, it was seen as a terrible contract. And you don't want to repeat that scenario. And that was a 4-year contract. So I'm talking about giving him 5 or 6 years. If it ages poorly, like, that's the risk you're taking, right? So I don't think it'll age poorly.
I just think that right from the get-go, it's not that the guy will be declining. He's been a very, very steady player, Jake Evans, and
he's steadily improving.
Yeah, but you're not crossing your fingers every night to see which version of Jake Evans you're going to see, the same way as it's been with Armia for a majority of his time in Montreal. Right. It's not that it would age poorly, but if on day one you probably give too much and you give term, at some point say, well, it's a lot of money for a guy who on a competitive team is for sure a fourth line center. And I love the guy. I want him to stay. I'm just trying to put myself in the GM's shoes, and how do we avoid making a mistake?
Yeah, well, Armia's contract when he signed it was 4.17% of the cap. So you have Lowry at 3.99, Armia at 4.17. Would you consider, in light of that, let's say, 3.5% of the cap as being appropriate for a fourth line center? Let's say that would get you to $3.2375 million. So basically, that $3.25 million figure we started with.
Yeah.
But again, I have to believe that for Jake Evans to accept a number like that, you're gonna have to compensate with term, or else he's gonna at least want to see what's on the market, what's out there. Maybe he comes back and says, okay, ultimately that's fine, let's do that. That's a risk you'd have to take. And then you have to
my impression is that teams that will be interested in him will probably see him as this way the Canadiens do, as a bottom six centerman. And if the need is a bottom six centerman, especially a fourth line centerman, the number of possibilities make it so that, if you're a contending team like the Devils, who maybe won't have a lot of money to spare in the next few years, they won't want to invest too much money in a guy who's going to be playing at the bottom of their lineup. He's a great fit as a rental because he's at 1.7 this year. But in the long run, I think that if it's too much money for the Canadiens or too much term for the Canadiens, I don't know who would pay him that sort of money unless they think that he's got such a big offensive upside at this point of his career that they could play him higher in the lineup and develop into more than what we've seen of him so far during his career. So, no, honestly, 3.25 seems like a very reasonable number, but I'm just not sure that the Canadiens will need to go to 5 or 6 years in order to make that deal happen.
So, Andrew Kopp, right? Andrew Kopp, who struck it rich with the Red Wings, signed a signed a 5-year contract worth $5.63 million a year.
Yeah.
Okay. That year, he came off a season where between the Jets and the Rangers, he scored 21 goals, 32 assists. Okay, he had 53 points.
Mm-hmm.
Prior years, 15 goals, 39 points, 10 goals, 26 points, 11 goals, 25 points, albeit he missed time in each of those seasons. So he didn't have this long track record of production like that, similar to Jake Evans. Now, Jake Evans' numbers are lower, but it just shows what happens when you hit it offensively in your contract year. What can happen? You know, it's a possibility. The other thing to remember is that Andrew Kopp was coming off a year where his contract was worth $3.64 million. So he's not going from Jake Evans territory straight up to 5.625, but it's an example of what can happen. You know, like, frankly, over his first 2 seasons on that contract, he outscored his contract here by 1 goal. His first 2 seasons combined.
Yeah.
So
it was a bad deal, man.
Of course it was a bad deal, but these deals happen. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, in free agency, if you're a player, and if I'm Jake Evans, I'm looking at this specific contract and being like, well, if he can get 5.63 or 5.625, I could get 4.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, it's not unreasonable to think that I could get 4. So that's my point,
at the other end of the spectrum, you've got a guy like Frédéric Gaudreau with the Minnesota Wild, who, prior to signing his new deal, had seasons of 44 points and then 38 points. 14 goals in 21-22 and 19 goals in 22-23. At the very end of that season, in April of 23, he signed a 5-year deal worth $2.1 million a year.
Yeah,
he's not exactly the same player as Evans. I think that Evans is a more, especially on the PK, is a more impactful player. But he
does more things.
Yeah. But still, I mean, in terms of, and Gaudreau is having a lot of missions, a lot of defensive missions, so or assignments, plus those two years, in terms of production are higher than what we've seen ever from Evans. Maybe it'll be different this year, but $2.1 million for 5 years. You got Andrew Kopp, which was ridiculous on one end, but Gaudreau was a bargain at that price for 5 years too. So I guess there's something in the middle to be found there.
Yeah, probably. It's also worth noting that Gaudreau has never really come close to matching that offensive production. I mean, that's the thing with Evans, is that, he's in his second season of that deal. He had 15 points in 67 games last year, 17 points in 42 games so far this year. So maybe he'll approach it this season, and he's having a pretty good season, but he again did not. And that's the tough part with the Evans thing, is that he's going to get paid based on what he produces this season. And any team that signs him should have no expectation that he'll ever produce like that ever again. Like, that's basically a given for him. It's, well, listen, let's move on. We've exhausted this. We've exhausted this basically, I hope what this shows is that this is not a simple, and I think your instinct is correct, and it's where my instinct has been from the get-go with this player, is that you do not want to fall in love with your fourth line players, right? It's really, you have to be prudent. And the Armia deal, because like Detroit didn't sign either Comfer or Cop with the intention of having him on their fourth line, right? It was not their purpose, misguided perhaps, but still not what they intended for those players to do. Jake Evans is clearly going to be signed, at least by the Canadiens and probably by any team if he ever hits the market, as a fourth line center. Like that will be his. So maybe that keeps his number down. And for the Canadiens' sake, they have to hope so, but for Jake Evans' sake, I agree with you that he's very self-aware, but he's also just very aware of economics. he understands economics. His brother works in finance on Wall Street, for crying out loud. Like, I mean, this guy's he's not dumb, right? So like he can go and he can, better than most players, like a lot of players will lean on their agents for this, but better than most players, he himself can probably calculate a number where his market value stands. And he's probably not going to be all that willing to go too far below that number, is all I'm saying.
I think that Jake once told me, he said, "Oh yeah, I'm the unsuccessful brother between us."
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
All
he
right.
said that after signing this contract, which, was worth whatever it was, $7-8 million total, it was like, so yeah. Okay. We've exhausted that topic. Let's move on to David Savard, which is another complicated topic, less so, but I think might become more of a complicated topic if this play continues, if the Canadiens continue playing this way, right? And if they remain in the mix, they remain competitive. We had a question in the mailbag about this. Someone brought this up in the mailbag. I'm sorry, I don't have your name, but it's something that I also thought about. But the specific example they gave, which I thought was very applicable to the David Savard situation, was last season, Sean Walker, right? So Sean Walker is one of the prime defensemen available on the market. The Flyers had him. The Flyers were in an unexpectedly competitive situation last season, but still had a plan to monetize some of their impending free agents, Walker being one of them. So they trade Walker to the Avalanche, and then turn around and acquire Eric Johnson from the Sabres to replace him in the short term, to not torpedo the Flyers' attempt to make the playoffs. And at the trade deadline, they were very much in the mix. Like, they were right there. Yeah. They just so happened to completely submarine after that and could just totally collapse right after the trade deadline. But, I could see something similar happening with Savard. It's a possibility. Like, if the price on him, we've discussed it on the podcast, like his player profile is always in demand. And so if you can add a second round pick for him and then use one of your third or fourth round picks to go pick up another defenseman from someone else that could temporarily replace him and not force you to bring up a Mayu. If Reinbacker's healthy there, play Reinbacker at that point, which could be a factor, right? Like, honestly, like the early part of the Reinbacker timeline would have him be back on March 1st, roughly, right? We don't know. We've got no health update on him, but if he were to be back healthy at that time, it would be even more tempting to move Savard, right? Like, it'd just be like, okay, well, but putting him in a situation where they're fighting for a playoff spot, that would not send a good message to the room. It would be putting him in a tough spot because the games are so consequential. Although he did fine with that in Laval last year. Not only fine, he thrived in the middle of a playoff race coming from Europe last year in Laval. But obviously not the same thing in the NHL. But there's also a lot of nuance to the David Savard situation, because if there's one thing the Canadiens might need in order, like if they were to look to improve and help their chances to make the playoffs. And I know that David Savard is a beloved teammate, but if you could upgrade on David Savard somehow, if you could somehow get a better defenseman into that spot, a guy who's more mobile, a guy who's less prone to tough stretches in games, I think that's an area where you could actually improve.
Yeah, the thing is, you have, if it's a question for them that's worth considering beyond the stretch here, if they think that Mailloux and or Reinbacher are not going to start the season, or Engstrom are going to start next season in Montreal, then you're still down a guy on the right side. Right. So it's good to keep.
Well, they're not signing Savard. I feel pretty confident saying that.
Yeah, I know, but what I'm thinking here is that when you say finding someone who's a better player than Savard, it would probably mean getting a guy who's got maybe one more year.
Right. Yeah.
Because otherwise, you're paying Peter to pay. You're lending from Peter to pay Paul or something.
You recently used this expression seamlessly on the podcast, and I was actually pretty impressed. Yeah. And now you've taken a step back. It's okay.
Yeah, I know. That's my whole English is taking a step back on certain days. But for the Canadiens to do that, you mentioned the fact that his player profile will be rare on the market. That's true. That's the only thing that could keep his value up. I think that Savard's competition on the market could be a guy like Jan Ruta in San Jose, who's a right-handed defenseman, veteran, and all that. But after hearing Kent Hughes mention how the culture of this team was growing, was important, just keeping Savard for the stretch, if they were competitive, would be significant enough.
Oh,
just not trading him and say.
I think just not trading all of their guys. That would be the message to the room. Like that would be the "we believe in you" message. If all four of these guys don't go anywhere on the deadline,
yeah, and that's a possibility.
It's a total possibility, 100%.
The other factor when it comes to Savard is how much of a leap forward can Jayden Struble do from now until March 7th? That's, he's been playing progressively better during the Savard's absence. Let's see how he fares in Washington on Friday night. He struggles against Chicago and then he got better. Mm-hmm. If he showed that he could be reliable enough to be your sixth defenseman playing on his offside for the remainder of the season, in the event that the Canadiens get a very good offer for Savard, great. But I think that you made a good point on Wednesday when you said that the Canadiens being competitive, it might move the needle as to what they would consider a good enough return to move him. And what they first thought was a good enough return to move Savard might not be the same if they think that, gosh, we really need to keep that presence in our lineup.
Well, I think that's what happened last season, right? Like last season, they set somewhat of an unreasonably high price on some, like they needed a first round pick to move Savard. I'm convinced of that. Like that was the bar. And if no one met that bar, and since, as we mentioned previously, but Tanev didn't get a first round pick. In fact, Monahan was, I think, the only player to fetch a first round pick. No, I could be wrong about that, but there weren't many, right? Monahan was one of few that actually managed to fetch a first round pick, if any.
Yeah.
So they kind of set that price saying like, okay, well, if we get a first round pick, we can't say no, but we're not likely to get it. And we're very comfortable keeping Savard if that's the case. I'm guessing this year that same scenario is a second round pick, but if the Canadiens don't need a second round pick, let's be honest. Like it's not something they're desperate to acquire. Having assets to trade is always good. Having picks to add players is always good, but it's that calculus does change when. If you were to trade Savard for a draft pick and not replace him, and replace him with Mayu or Reinbacher or someone that's not as experienced, and the culture aspect of David Savard is very high. Almost, I would argue, probably higher than Jake Evans because of how young their defense is and the extent to which those young defensemen look up to him. Just yesterday, I don't know if you were watching, but I was watching Lane Hudson just skating around with David Savard before practice, and like just kind of the way he looks at him, the way he talks about him, the way every young defenseman talks about him shows the value he has to those guys. And so, I think the Carrier acquisition for sure made it easier for the Canadiens to trade David Savard, but there might be no player whose fate is more tied to these next 22 games than David Savard. If the Canadiens play themselves out of contention, then for sure he's getting traded. Like, there's no doubt in my mind that he's going to get traded. But if they are within sniffing distance of a playoff spot, say 4 points or fewer on March 7th, I think keeping him as known rental is a definite possibility. Like, there's very few alternatives in that price range, right? Like, Cody Ceci would be a guy that you could get from San Jose, for instance. Like, like, is that really an upgrade? Like, he's more mobile than Savard is, but he's prone to defensive lapses that are far worse than Savard's. It's not really.
They don't have the same job description at all.
No, exactly. So it's not a clear upgrade, and it's not even like it just doesn't seem to be worth the trouble. If you're going to trade away Savard and get a second and then use a third or fourth to go get CC, just keep Savard, like it's so. But again, they're going to have to play themselves out of contention for me to definitively trade David Savard. I think they're going to have to be out of the mix between now and March 7th.
At the point where they are in their build, would there be any reasoning behind trading Savard and try to find an upgrade for next year before you're sure that one of Mayu or Reinbacher can take over? Because I've seen a number of Canadiens fans
they need two right shot
ask for Rasmus Anderson from Calgary, who's going to be a highly sought player. And the fit would be great. But
phenomenal.
But at the same time, are the Canadiens at this point, are they advanced enough in their progression that paying assets to get a guy like that, who's going to play on your second pair or your top pair, actually, for just one more year before you ask yourself the question, do we resign him or not? Is it worth spending the assets, or are the Canadiens just not there yet?
I think it could be, because don't forget, like they only have two right shot D right now. If you trade Savard, you're back down to one, which was the situation. Well, I mean, basically the situation before the Carrier trade. They had Barron, but they didn't really consider him a viable option. The thing with Calgary is, they have 2 firsts, 2 seconds, and a third in 2025. They have 2 firsts in 2026, then a second and 2 thirds. So it's not as if they're screaming for picks, although they do have, they could be interested in their own first round pick for this year. That could interest them. But yeah, honestly, I think anything's on the table, especially if Calgary has to play themselves out of content. Calgary would have to play themselves into sell mode
for sure.
So that's a consideration. And if they do that, they might get to pick, if they really plummet, then they might get to just keep their pick, regardless if it winds up being a top 10 pick. So, it's an interesting scenario. I think it's something that they should consider. They would have to consider, because I think this year, one thing that the Canadiens have learned, and Kent flat out said it, having 5 young defensemen is probably too many. And so they're not going to turn around and do the same thing next year. So I think maybe Anderson is the luxury item, But
yeah, and some of your treasure chest, you have to you have to dig into that to get a guy who's going to be so coveted. So I was asking the question because as much as I would like the Canadiens to improve by going after that player, the fact that he signed only for one more year, you're like, okay, it's not as if the Canadiens are. This is a move that a contender makes more than a team that's just on its way to becoming a playoff team.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think this is something that, if it were to happen, would happen in the offseason.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is something you do at the draft. And that's if the Flames even want to trade him. And so, and the reality is you would probably have to give up a pick, and you'd probably have to give up a young defenseman like Engstrom, let's say, which would be a pretty high price. But I mean, so yeah, maybe they're not there yet, but when Savard leaves, whether that's at the deadline or whether that's in the offseason, they're going to need a right shot D with experience, at least one, if not two. So Anderson is the luxury item, but there are lots of teams. Well, they can go looking for one elsewhere. They don't have to get a top pairing guy necessarily.
That was really a part that was interesting in Kent Hughes' midseason avail. The fact that he mentioned the fact that five young defensemen was too much. They had come to that conclusion because it meant that some of them were put in a situation where they had to face uber tough competition, and some of them were just not ready for that, especially in road games where you don't have control of the matchups. It's been
as encouraging as Struble looked. Like, I think Struble's the most indicative of this. Like, he was a guy that was very different at home than on the road. Mm-hmm. Marty was very worried playing him on the road. At home, he looked great to me. Like, when going into New Jersey, when Marty seemed almost annoyed with Struble, like he was asked about, Struble's ceiling looks really high, but his floor some nights, and he was just flat out. He's got to get his floor higher. I don't know what he's got to do something, but we can't go into a game not knowing what we're going to get. He was just very blunt about just the lack of consistency in Struble's game. And I spoke to Struble after the Barron trade because it became obvious that he was going to have a tough time getting into the lineup. And he was so distraught. Like, he was like, I really thought I was playing well when I got taken out of the lineup. Like, I don't even know. Because I was like, did you feel like some hesitancy creep into your game? And like, he was just kind of like, yeah, I guess so. And then he was like, but I didn't really feel that way. Like, something happened. So maybe you're right. Maybe it was hesitancy, but I felt like I was playing really well. And all of a sudden I was out of the line. Like, he seemed confused by the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So I'm only retelling that because I think that's emblematic of what happens when you put young players in this situation and their confidence is so fragile that just getting taken out of the lineup and not being entirely sure why made it so that Struble had to reevaluate things, and he seemed ill-prepared to do that. And frankly, Struble's experience on the Barron trade was the most unique because he was at that dinner with Barron, but didn't go home with him. Took an Uber home, went straight to bed, woke up in the morning and got a text message from his mom saying that Barron just got traded. And so if there's any player that's going to hit hardest of that group, which included Pezzetta, Gouli, and Jackeye, it would have been Struble. And they're like, whoa, okay. That changed in a hurry, like Barron's gone. I just had dinner with him last night. Now he's gone. He's out of the city. Like, so yeah, it was a telling part of the Hughes thing. And I think, to your point, if it's not Rasmus Anderson, which would be the ultimate luxury buy, it'll be someone. There'll be some sort of veteran defenseman brought in if and when David Savard is not on the team next year.
Speaking of our friend Barron, because everybody's been gushing about how the contribution of Alexandre Carrier since he joined the Canadiens. So he was he had a game against St. Louis at the end of December where he ended up being a -3 in less than 7 minutes of play.
Right.
So the game after, he was not playing.
Yeah, that'll happen.
Yeah. But he's been playing 17:31, 18:07, 17:29, and then 2 days ago against Winnipeg, he played 15:24. So he's being given some ice time. He's being given a look, just like they intended to.
Mhm.
But it's not necessarily as though overnight the Nashville Predators struck gold by getting Justin Barrett. Okay, moving on to our next guy, who's Yoel Armia.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've been on the bandwagon of, there's a chance that they might re-sign him.
Yeah, that's not based on anything. Like, I don't have any inside information. I haven't even talked to Army about it. I haven't talked to anyone, sources, whatever. Like, that's just my own impression. Like, what I have talked to Army about is just how much he likes it here. I talked to him about, what he and his partner did when Laine arrived in town. They had a previous relationship. They were in the Jets organization together. They're from Finland, obviously. Not from the same town, but still they have like experience in Finnish hockey circles. And he was just like, I remember his answer. He's like, I didn't show up too much, just like some places to eat. And he's like, this city's so great that he'll figure it out on his own. And so, yeah, like this is a guy who likes it here a lot. And he's also a guy who understands better than most that a change of environment is not always that easy to manage. And so I don't think he's going to get traded. I'd be surprised. Even though of the four guys, I could see him, his unique package, people who remember him from the 21 playoffs, people who have obviously watched him play this season, scouts who are at the Bell Center regularly would see just how consistent he's been all year, what he does to maintain possession and encourage possession in the offensive zone, that maybe he could be someone that they would pitch. But, if they could get him signed to a 2-year deal at $2 million a year, would you do that?
I would let him walk.
Oh, yeah?
Honestly. Yeah.
Explain yourself.
If to me, for the Canadiens to sign Armia again, Brendan Gallagher would probably have to go because it's just at some point the number of bottom six guys that you keep around, that you sign, and that remain at the bottom of your lineup, and you have a big coat, big layer of veteran experience. I understand that it's important, but I think that you need to be able to open the door to other guys, and it's not necessarily, and even the good ones are probably not going to be given, like the red carpet the way maybe Ivan Demidov will be given. But if you want to be able to get the bar rolling a little bit, you need to give up some room, and you cannot. I think that it would be some sort of committing the same mistake to re-sign him again because of, it's not necessarily recency bias, because there's a level of stability in his game now that's very interesting to see, and I recognize that, but I would be a lot more comfortable if there was another guy in the bottom six that was leaving, so that I say, okay, fine, we've got a role for him. He'll be on a fourth line, and it will be okay. So that's why I'm saying Gallagher. It could have been Anderson for that matter, but
Dvorak is leaving. There is another guy in the bottom six that is leaving.
Yeah, but it's a sentiment in this case.
Yeah.
So,
and I agree with you in the sense that you'd like to see a path for, let's say, Luke Tuck to have a chance to make the team out of camp. Not necessarily for sure make it, but give him a window.
Yeah,
he'll be 23 next year. Like it's He'll be 23 in March, actually. So I mean, it's really like it's you're verging on the time where Luke Tuck might be an option for you on that fourth line.
Yeah, and if if you get better at the top, there's a chance that Heineman might stay on your fourth line next year too. Yeah. So I think that without getting too young, and God knows I've been banging on that drum that the Canadiens needed to have that experience and those stabilizing elements, even up front. But at some point, you need to be able to save your bullets and give your money to better players, and make sure that your promising youngsters at least have one door that's open, even if it's a revolving door and it's one spot that's rotated by whoever's more deserving. And you have a guy who can, in the meantime, stay there as a placeholder. But if you commit to Armia again, he'll be more than a placeholder, because you'll identify him as a key cog of your PK once again. And
so do you keep him as known rental? If the Canadiens are, do you keep him as known rental if the Canadiens are in the picture of a playoff spot, or do you? Because I think if you put Armia on the market, I think there are teams that would, a right shot guy with his size who could protect the puck the way he can and play a playoff style of hockey and kill penalties the way he can. Like, I think his value would be reasonably high if the Canadiens are willing to retain money on him. They could probably get something pretty good for him.
Well, you just hit it right on the nail with the retaining money. The fact that the Canadiens only have one retention slot, if they want to move Dvorak, they'll need to dedicate that slot to Dvorak. Because otherwise, because nobody will want Dvorak at that number. So to make him remotely attractive, you need to eat up some salary. So then you're left with dangling Armia at his current salary.
Yeah.
If you dedicate the retention slot,
I don't think they're trading both of them though.
That's why I think that they're more likely to keep Armia in that sense, and
then just let him walk. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that kind of settles the Dvorak discussion, because I don't really see. I mean, I could see them keeping him also as an own rental. Like, if it continues, like he's an important player on the team right now. People don't want to really see it or admit it, or people have an intense dislike for this player. And I get it. I understand why, but he's an important player for the team. He really is. And the players and the coaches see that. So, and even at 50% retained, you're still looking at 2.22 and change for Dvorak, which is still a lot for that type of player, who would be playing on a fourth line on any contending team. And you could argue but those third and fourth lines are pretty much interchangeable right now. So,
yeah.
Sorry. But I just don't know. I don't know how big of a market there will be for Christian Dvorak, even at 50% retained, which is why which is why I'm asking about Armia. Mm-hmm. But if they want to trade Savard, they're probably going to have to retain money on him. So they only get to pick one guy that they can retain money on. So it might come down to who's bringing back the most value. He's the guy who gets that retention slot.
Look, if they're in the hunt, they're not going to sell those guys. It's as simple as that, because outside of Evans, there's nobody really that has the potential to have significant value. Maybe Savard, but I doubt it. I think that everybody throughout the league sees what we see from David. He's slower than he was before. He's not as effective. They're limiting his minutes. So there's an argument to be made about his utility on a playoff team, but I'm not sure that it's going to amount to a big return. So if they're contending for a playoff spot, all those fourth, fifth pick that they could get more, they won't consider it worth their while. So
yeah. So we did all that just to say that they're probably not going to do anything. We've been talking about an hour. We've been spending an hour talking about what we can do with these guys, and our conclusion is nothing's going to happen. So thank you
Yeah.
for listening, everyone. But no, it is contingent on them actually being in contention, and that would be to me the ultimate reward for these players would be like, this is the sign we're sending you, and we've seen that in recent years, and it's possible to do both. Like Washington did it last year, right? I mean, they had like kind of a semi buy and sell trade deadline.
They've done that 2 years in a row. They started
Right.
2 years ago with when they acquired Rasmus Sandin while they were selling.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think anything's possible, but I think the most interesting buy sell candidate to me, like sell Savard, buy a player, ideally who could play this year and next,
Yeah.
and they have the assets to do that. So we'll see. Listen, that took a lot longer than we thought it would. So we had other stuff planned. The one thing I do want to mention that I found interesting from the Hughes press conference that we didn't get into on Wednesday, and that I think is kind of a telling thing, is when he mentioned that this is the first time for our hockey administration, our hockey operations people, to be in an environment with so much negativity, and that we would be crazy to think it wasn't going to happen, but we learned from that, and we're going to learn how to manage that in the future. And that came somewhat unsolicited. Like that was something he kind of came up with on his own in the midst of answering a question that wasn't specifically about that. Like no one asked him, how did you handle the negativity of the Canadiens? He brought that up on his own in the context of another answer, and the actual specific question escapes me right now, but it showed, they always talked, Ken Hughes has talked about it, like Bob Rob has talked about it, how their evaluation of players is based on how they can handle this market. Well, they themselves just got a crash course in how to handle this market because they were starting to be questioned. There was a lot of the shine off the Gordon Hughes administration back in November. They were taking a lot of heat. Marty was taking a lot of heat. Like it was, so I don't know, like I found that telling in the sense, like it just seemed like he wasn't prepared for the honeymoon to already be over when they kind of clearly communicated at the beginning of the season that they are still in a rebuild. They're entering a different phase of the rebuild, but it's still a rebuild. Expectations should be tempered. And, they raised those expectations, I think, somewhat unwittingly with the whole in the mix thing, and maybe regretted doing that based on the backlash when they weren't hitting it. I think there's a lot to be drawn out of that one line, where, I think maybe the actual lesson might be in messaging and management of expectations, and making sure that they give, maybe from now on, they're going to undershoot their expectations at the beginning of the season, because that sounded like, not to make it too dramatic, but it sounded like there was like a little bit of trauma from what happened back like 15 games into the season.
So you're you're a proponent of the undersell, over deliver.
So my strategy in university was I always attended my first class late. I made sure I showed up late to my first class of every course. That way, the bar was for me to be late, so that when I was on time, it was like a pleasant surprise. It's like, oh, look, he's here, and class is starting. So I've always
now I understand certain things.
yes, yeah, exactly. And so yeah, I think I do think that there was some internal regret over how they handled the messaging prior to the season.
Yeah.
And I think that comment was a reflection of it.
Well, Kent clearly wanted to get it off his chest. It's something that had affected.
And not only that, but the clarification on in the mix that happened later on in the press conference.
Right.
When he was asked directly about it,
Yeah. But the whole negativity, the experience of negativity, is the part that I feel has been a harsh realization through the first half of this season. at every level of the organization. It's not just the players. Some players have felt it, and it was like, whoa, you know, they did not feel like the benefit of the doubt period had prolonged to this season.
Talk to Kirby Doc about that, man.
There you go. Yeah, for sure. Doc being one guy. Well, speaking of Doc, the management started to be second guessed because of their trades. The Doc trade, Newhook. You know, there's been a lot of questions. Was he worth spending those assets to get a guy like that?
Justin for the Lehkonen trade,
yeah. No, that's Justin Barron.
That's what I said, Barron.
Barron for the Lehkonen trade. You know, carrying 3 goalies so that you protect Primo, and only to see Primo give you that sort of hockey. So there were arguments against management. And the head coach too. I think that the negativity and the criticism, the negative pressure that comes with the Montreal environment, I think affected Martin Saint-Louis a great deal, and that's where there was like the apprenticeship or the learning through hardship came for the most part to Martin Saint-Louis, and there was potentially some damage control to be done, or some, you know, calming down the waters. I think that he was, I suspect he was taken aback at some point by how big it got, you know, and the all the criticism about he's not a real professional coach, and you know, he's the minor league coach, blah blah blah. So they got out of that storm. And I think that they're more knowledgeable and stronger for it. So in that sense, it's a good thing that it happened. But for all those people who came with the rebuild, both management, coaches, and the younger players, and all those who came with the turnover, it's a little bit of the end of the innocence period.
There was a definite end of honeymoon at the beginning of the season, for sure. I mean, there was definite, because it was drastic, you know, and now they're getting the opposite of that. So they're getting both sides of it. But yeah, it was telling. Those 2 parts of the press conference where the first time we dealt with negativity, now we're going to know how to manage it, and what he meant by in the mix, which I think was obvious at the time when they talked about in the mix. They said it at the golf tournament. They said, we need our players to experience these things. Like everything he said on Wednesday was said at the golf tournament. And the thing is, you can't, one goes with the other. Like he was like, more so than the playoffs, we needed our players to experience that. Well, in order for your players to experience that, you need to be in the mix for the playoffs. Like they go hand in hand. Like they're not 2 separate things. So the clarification wasn't a huge clarification. Like for your players to experience the pressure of must-win games in February, March, and later in the season, you need to be within reasonable striking distance of a playoff spot. You know, I think the Flyers learned a lot about some of their guys when they crumbled down the stretch, you know, and that's valuable. And their guys learned what it takes at that time of year. You know, John Tortorella famously, guys, like we're right there. Let's go get it. You know, we're there. We can taste it. Let's go. Like that's valuable. Detroit, I've mentioned it numerous times, but those last 2 games against Canadiens, like, you know, Lane Hudson, those being his first 2 NHL games, like if I'm Lane Hudson, I'm looking across the way at the Red Wings, and like, I can't wait for that. Like I'm looking forward to that. I want to be in that, you know, same thing with all the other young guys. Like that's what we want. And so it didn't need clarifying, but the fact that Hughes felt it needed clarifying showed that he probably has the impression it was misunderstood in some way, but really it wasn't. You know, like in the mix means what it means. Like it's not a very complicated concept. It's like you're in the mix means you're in the playoff conversation, and that's where they are right now, and that's where they hope to be so that the players can experience that environment. Nothing's really changed in that regard. All that's changed is how often in the mix got repeated ad nauseum in the market every day, seemingly for weeks.
Yeah.
And he probably felt like he was being thrown back in his face when the team was last in the NHL.
For sure. There must have been a certain amount of regret. Say, you know what? If it was to be done all over again, we would frame it differently.
Yeah.
So that we would then we would not have to go through all this, this criticism and those slaps in the face that we get every day. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the team was resilient enough to go through that and proved to be good enough to be a team that's in the mix. So
yeah. And they're better for it.
Yeah.
You mentioned Kirby Dach. Like Kirby Dach, not quite yet come out the other side, but he's coming out the other side of it right now. It's a valuable experience for him. He's going to come out of this a more well-rounded player, in the sense that having gone through this adversity, having gone through the criticism and everything that he was getting, facing the music relatively regularly over that period, like he didn't really hide that much.
No.
He wasn't talking every day or anything, but he spoke often enough and was pretty candid about how he was playing. Like he handled it like a professional. And now he's coming out the other side, and he'll be better for it. Juraj Slafkovsky, we had a conversation with him just yesterday. You wrote a story. It's really good. I read it. It was a good conversation, and he's still in it. He's still looking for that version of himself, and he'll be better for it when he gets out of it. And I have no doubt he will get out of it. Just because he's so aware that he's not out of it, and so it's, these are valuable experiences. And the second half of the season, I think the Canadiens are hopeful that this team forces them to stand pat and that they can experience more of those things.
Arpin, before we move to Future Friday, I would like to remind all of our listeners that if you are not a subscriber to our podcast, you can go to BasuandGodin.com, and because we have this Friday episode that's available to all, but you can also subscribe and get our Monday episode, which is behind a paywall. We have occasionally, when news are relevant, we have those extra little emergency pods that we release. So people that become paid subscribers, they can either choose a monthly plan, so it's $5 a month, or you can have a yearly plan. And the annual plan, it's not like the hockey season; it's really 12 months. So if you were to get a subscription now, well, it would run from January to January. So I just want to make it clear that people, if they think, it's too late in the season to subscribe for a year anyway, well, that's not. We don't follow hockey schedules. We just follow the regular calendar. So it's
the regular
calendar. So it's 12 months, and so that's it. We invite everybody to subscribe and grow our community. We have over 2,000 people already that are subscribers. So that's it's exciting.
And over 1,000 of you are paid subscribers. So thank you for that. And also we have another tier of membership, which is called the founding member, which I guess at some point we're going to have to change as this podcast continues in the future years. But to our founding members, we're going to have our Google Meet, probably not next week, but the week after. You'll be getting an email about that. Our monthly Google Meet with our founders. And if you want to become a founding member and take part in that Google Meet, you can do so. That's also an annual subscription, so it would run from this January to next January. It just comes at a higher price. But so it's $100 to be a founding member, $50 for an annual membership, $5 a month for the monthly membership. Or you can just remain a free subscriber. We're happy to have you as well. Just take part in these conversations. The other question is that up until now, our chat on Substack has been open to all subscribers, free included. In the coming days, relatively shortly, the paywall is going to be flipped on for the chat. So that's going to be reserved for our paid subscribers, which is where we get our mailbag questions and which is where the great banter happens every game. There's people talking back and forth. It's like its own little social media network. And so we want to make that sort of a value add for our paid subscribers. So it's been open until now. We're gonna put
honestly, I thought it was only for the paid subscribers.
I thought it was only for paid subscribers too, but we realized it's not. And we wanted we want that to be a perk of the paid subscription, and that was always our intent, and that's actually what we've said on the podcast in the past. So, yeah, that's what's going to happen in the next little while. Not immediately, but very shortly, sometime later this month. Okay, Future Friday. Future Friday. So, Future Friday this week, we had actually something planned. We're going to save that for a later date because, we did have Kent Hughes up there talking about Ivan Demidov, right? I thought, he didn't say anything overly revealing or telling, but I thought his overview of the trip itself was interesting. The motivation behind it, and mainly, for him to come out and say the things that his coach wants to see from Demidov, they shared that opinion, like a tacit endorsement of how he's been coached, because Rotenberg has been roasted in Montreal for Ivan Demidov's management, right? So that was an interesting part of it as well. And then to say that he doesn't know if there's a link between the visit and the way Demidov's been playing or the ice time he's been receiving.
It seems like a strange coincidence.
I don't know about that. Like on December 19th, Ivan Demidov played 9:47 against Torpedo, scored a goal in that time, but 9:47. Previous game, 10:56, 8:37, 6:44, 8:24, 6:46, 9:54. I could go on. From December 21st onward, he has played 7 games. 6, 2, 4,
no, 7.
6 games.
Since
December 21st. He has failed to hit 15 minutes in one of them. He just snapped his goal scoring streak just on Wednesday when he didn't get a point or a goal against Spartak in a 5-0 loss, but still played 18:37 in that game. Things have changed drastically for Ivan Demidov, and it was just interesting to hear him say, the most interesting part to me was Ken Hughes saying that we wanted to communicate to him that regardless of the individual results, he is very important to our organization. And to go to all that trouble to get over there and just to do that kind of showed a level of care that I think is important. And even the criticism that they took for doing it, I think they had to know that was going to happen, and they did it anyway. Like that's a good message to send to like a young cornerstone player that you hope is going to play in your organization for years to come.
It's funny because there's a lot of politics behind that. When Kent Hughes says that he agreed with the way that the coach has been, at least in principles, in the ideas of bringing the young player, to a different stage. I think that it's a good thing that Kent Hughes presents a voice or at least an appearance of agreeing with Rotenberg, because now things are working the way that he was hoping it would work, with Demidov playing a regular shift, producing a ton, and things are back to where he was hoping they would be for Demidov the whole season. So it certainly would not be time to put, to throw oil on the fire and say, you know what, this guy is completely out of his mind, and start a diplomatic quarrel with the SKA St. Petersburg head coach. That being said, there's also politics during their trip there. There was a video that was released by the club there where you see Rotenberg for almost half an hour.
27 minutes.
So
of the most banal conversation you have ever witnessed in your life.
Terrible.
Yes.
So he's on one side of the table and you got Le Cavalier, Hughes, and Bobroff on the other side. Boring chit chat, and I don't know if they noticed it, but Rothenberg had a microphone right here, like a little lavalier, just like the one that I bought and that I'm going to have hopefully for my next episode.
The one that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Well, Rothenberg's was working, so yeah.
And exactly. So I mean, the whole thing is that I feel as though they were pawned into a bit of propaganda this whole time.
100% they were.
And what I thought, and they got a lot of flack for that, but what I thought was interesting was hearing Hughes say, you know what, we were not the only NHL team over there.
Yeah.
As if the Canadiens dared to cross, the Russian frontier, get into that country and scout some players and whatnot, and it was perceived, it was portrayed as almost a geopolitical mistake. But it was interesting from Hughes to say there were other teams there, but it was certainly not publicized the same way.
Well, they're not posing for pictures, it's like that's
exactly. So that's where St. Petersburg is. Oh yeah, come on guys, let's take one more picture. Let me shoot this video for my Instagram account. So it did not look great. No matter how Hughes wants to present it, it didn't look good. But they were there to see him play. They were there to reassure Demidov and say, you know what, you got all these contract extension offers on the table. Don't sign them. Mm-hmm. We believe in you and we want you in Montreal in autumn. So all that messaging needed to be done face to face. So after that, the rest of the noise, they're going to live with it because the reason why they went was mission accomplished in that sense.
Yeah, and it further emphasized, like even Rothenberg says it, like, thank you so much for coming. It was a lot of trouble to come, and like they had to go through Turkey, and there's like all this. It's not easy entering Russia or exiting Russia for that matter at this point. There's only a handful of places you can do it. Turkey is the main one, and so it was a long trip. And my understanding is that some of the things that came out, the Canadiens weren't fully aware of what they were going to be used for. I think that video is one of them. But for sure, like they had to be a willing participant. Like, they were being welcomed by the organization. You can't go to visit an organization in Russia, visit their building, and be like, well, we're not going to do we're not going to pose for pictures. We're not going to talk. Like it's, you can't do that. So I think they understood the potential ramifications of their visit being publicized, being used by Scott and Rothenberg in particular as some sort of validation of what they're doing. And it was like, and obviously Rothenberg, his family, Scott ownership are incredibly aligned with Putin. It's a very political sort of atmosphere that they walked into, a touchy one, undoubtedly. But I think they knew that, and they did it anyway. Yeah. And whether you agree with that or not, and I think it's perfectly valid to disagree with that and say, no, you shouldn't be. And I think Dominik Hasek was the most vocal person to come out and rip him for it, much like he's ripped the NHL in general for allowing Ovechkin to play and all sorts of things, but all valid, all 100% valid. But I think the Canadiens went there knowing this was not only a possibility, but a probability, because there is a dubious ethical wall here in terms of going to a country that is at war and that is ostensibly the enemy in this case. It's like it's a tough political it's a political landmine, really. To have Rothenberg talking about, we need Russia and Canada to be playing together, and we need to be back in international, and then like, what are they supposed to do? Like, just kind of like, oh yeah, I guess, yeah, it's kind of hard. It's a bit of a tough spot, but to me, it really And I honestly, no judgment on anyone who feels that that's wrong and that they shouldn't have done that. That's fine. But to me, it was just an example of the lengths to which they were willing to go to ensure that this prime player, this piece of their rebuild, is okay, that he knows that his future is secure in Montreal, and also that there was a level of concern, a heightened level of concern over how this player was being used, and the possibility that he might be cracking under sort of the high standards he was being held to by this coach.
Yeah, and during his press conference, Hughes mentioned that instead of the good old line of saying we don't want to sign an older player or have a older player who could block a younger player from blossoming and developing in our lineup, which is something that he said repeatedly in the past. He said, well, if there's another Lane Hutson that shows up, and we're not going to stop him or refrain him from cracking a spot on our lineup just because he's young. There's not a lot of Lane Hutsons in their pipelines of guys of that caliber. But if there's one guy that could be on the fast track, just like Hutson was once he turned pro, it's Demidov. So I think it was clear that he could not be part of the Montreal Canadiens for contract reasons this year. Even if the Canadiens were to be a playoff team, they would not have been able to sign him on time. There was just no way that it was possible. But next year, it's clearly their hope that he's going to be able to come over. And to facilitate that, having at least, again, I'm talking about the diplomatic aspect of it, but having a political, a positive contact with Rothenberg and St. Petersburg
that's quite the Freudian slip there.
Yeah. But anyway, it's important that they have positive contacts with the Russian club there in order to facilitate that transition.
Yeah. And listen, it's undeniable. Like, he can question the link all he wants. I mean, 3 of his last 4 games, Demidov has played more than 18 minutes. He hadn't played more than 18 minutes in the game all season. So,
yeah, and he's back at scoring insane goals. The way,
the kid's a stud. So, just briefly, quickly, just also kind of Future Friday relevant, not relevant to Demidov, but the other nugget from Ken Hughes. We did Michael Hage as our Future Friday segment last week. I speculated, or I suggested that in my opinion, Michael Hage is probably headed back to Michigan for a second year based on what he said. And just based on his development and how, Michigan, the team, would probably be a better spot for him to have another year there. Well, Ken Hughes basically confirmed it on Wednesday, saying, kind of comparing Michael Hage's college time with Lane Hutson and saying Lane Hutson benefited greatly from going back for a second year. It made him more ready to come to the NHL and make an impact, and strongly suggested Michael Hage will likely do the same thing. So there you have it. Probably going to have another year of Michael Hage in Michigan. I don't think that'll bother him one bit. In fact, I think he would love to do that. And so yeah, there we have it. This has been a very, very long episode of our podcast.
Yes, I know. I think we're breaking all the records.
Yeah.
All right. Well, to those of you who made it till the end, we salute you. And so the Canadiens are having this interesting doubleheader, back-to-back games Friday night in Washington, Saturday against the Stars in Montreal. We'll be back for our subscribers on Monday, otherwise next Friday. So thanks to everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. So have a good weekend.